And 95% of comics are sold to males. Thanks, Ty. One comic that dealt with violence on a more than a crash-bang-boom level was Swamp Thing. Let's talk to Steve Bissette, the editor of Taboo magazine and the former artist on Swamp Thing. Steve, it's Commander Rick. How was the violence in Swamp Thing different from the super-duper hero comics?
Well, the violence in Swamp Thing was very different because we saw Swamp Thing as being, not as being a superhero book, it was a horror book. And the use of violence in horror fiction, if you will, whether it's comics or film or the written word, is very different from the use of violence in superhero books. It's not an expression of power. In fact, more often than not, it's an expression of helplessness. One of the aspects of the horror genre that came to the fore in the early 80s, the so-called slasher movies, I mean, it was just this meditation on a really adolescent level of how fragile we are. We're basically sort of bags of blood and meat that walk around, and if you puncture us, all this stuff comes out. And that aspect very rarely crops up in superhero comics. You know, they really are in a fantasy never world. If you will, I'll use these definitions. I once read that there are two ways of looking at fantasy literature. There's the marvelous, where anything can happen at any time. And I guess I would put forth as an example, if you take away the framing device of Alice in Wonderland is a piece of marvelous fiction. Anything can happen. Any sort of being can walk in. It can say and do anything. The fantastic concerns itself with the dream world, the unreal, breaking into our day-to-day reality. So, you know, without trying to be pretentious, I would say that superhero comics for me always were marvelous. That's part of why they never mattered much to me. Anything could happen. Superman can do anything. And even as a little boy, I lost interest because I went, well, if he can do anything, what's to worry? I mean, you know, whatever you can throw at him, he's going to come out of it, and he'll probably be able to rescue everyone else as well. In the fantastic, which is what Swamp Thing was, there were repercussions. You could be hurt. You could die.
Yeah, I know that feeling. Thanks, Steve. I guess this is what I'm getting at about being gratuitous. I mean, people don't just get up and walk away. They lie there moaning and groaning. Let's stick to violence. I mean, it's one thing to have marvelous fiction or fantastic fiction. It's quite another to say the good guy shot the bad guy and felt real proud. That's not how people feel. That's the lie. Louis Shiner writes marvelous fiction in the Wild Cards, which are anthologies of short stories about superheroes, and he's done fantastic fiction like The Deserted Cities of the Heart, Death Squads, and Magic in Central America. Louis, it's Commander Rick. How do you avoid glorifying violence?
Consequences, I think, in a single word. The kind of writing that glamorizes violence to me is that which pretends there aren't any real consequences to it. Rambo, the movie, being a classic example in which you've got a character who is set up in a situation where all of the people he's going to kill are set up as completely evil and worthless. We never have to see any of their relatives weeping over their mangled bodies, and he himself is given the luxury of not having to feel any qualms for having killed them because he's put into this completely artificial structure. Whereas I think if you're going to deal with violence, you have to confront it as a real person.
I want the violence in the book to have some ramifications. That's even shown in the script. If somebody gets hit on the head, they go to the hospital. You don't see that a lot in comics, but we do a lot of hospital scenes in this tree. I don't like the current trend towards splatter comics. I don't like that aesthetic. I don't want to see blood splattering all over the pages. But then again, I don't want to portray violence as something that you can just gloss over. If someone is murdered in our comic book story, I want that to be ugly. And so I will show blood and I will show a certain amount of gore, but I don't want to do that to titillate the reader. I just want to tell the story in the most effective way possible and give the emotion and the mood that's necessary to make the point we're trying to make.
But it seems to me there's a lot of violence masquerading as mood, purporting to be plot, balancing on that fine line between good taste and gleeful gobs of gore. The real terror of violence is the consequences, not just the exit wounds the size of Minneapolis, but the hidden consequences, emotional scars the size of Pittsburgh. But it's hard to draw a bruised psyche in a comic book. That's where novelists have the advantage. They can explore the repercussions of violence. Take Peter Straub. He's the best-selling author of Ghost Story, Coco, and Mystery. His latest book is a collection of short stories called Houses Without Doors. Peter, it's Rick. You once wrote that the only way to understand violence is to wrap it in imagination. What did you mean by that?
The only way to understand anything is to approach it through imagination, I think. Because I think that imagination is what we generally call intelligence. It evokes a kind of empathic understanding. Now, violence is difficult to approach this way because our natural tendency is to deny it or flee from it. Most non-horror works that approach the question of violence do it from the outside, do it from a detached, rational viewpoint. That is, there is some madman out there murdering people in one disgusting way or another, and the task of both the reader and the protagonist is to identify him and capture him. What I'm more interested in is seeing the world through that person's eyes and trying to figure out what made him be that way. Violence will only work in a book if it seems to happen in a world in which real people move through a real landscape having real feelings. That means that the writer behind this world has to imagine not only the world, but the inner world of all those characters.
As a horror writer, I'm sure this is something you think of every time you sit down at the typewriter, but are you afraid you're glorifying violence?
No, I don't feel that. I'm trying to wrap it in my imagination and to look at it, but you can't really glorify it. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that's the effect of what I do. In Coco, there's a character like a serial killer. He isn't a true serial killer because there's a reason, kind of, for what he's doing, and he kills people he knows. Serial killers hardly ever kill anybody they know, and they don't care much. They don't see the people as people. But in that book, one is led, I think, ultimately to feel pity for once we discover who it is, we feel pity for the man who's done it. Because we've learned, in a sense, why he's doing it. We've visited his childhood, and it's like a cold, dark, locked room. And we feel sorry for the child that emerged from that room.
Thanks, Peter. We'll talk again. Does violence in a book or a comic or a movie encourage violence in the audience? Well, remember The Warriors, the movie about the LA street gangs? The studios were worried that there would actually be gang fights in the theaters. Nancy, access the Walter Hill tape. I was watching some movie show a little while back, and Walter Hill was on it. Walter directed The Warriors, and he's going to be directing Aliens 3. He had some really interesting things to say about violence. Run it, Nancy.
Drama depends upon violence. There are different kinds of violence. There's emotional violence. There's physical violence. I mean, Wuthering Heights is a very violent story. The emotional damage that these people do to each other is catastrophic. I just think that the issue of violence has been it's just been a straw horse that's been beaten kind of senselessly by certain types of people whose agenda is not artistic, it's political. And that these people really want some kind of society that is leveled and planned. And I think that the audience will always resist that.
Fairy tales and fantasy stories are full of violence. Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, Conan the Barbarian. Modern fantasy is less violent than it used to be, but some writers, like Canada's Charles De Lint, create some pretty gruesome stuff. Charles, it's Commander Rick. How do you handle violence in your stories?